So I'm Rita Goldberg, and I'm a member of the Cary Lecture Committee, and we are delighted to welcome all of you to this hall, Cary Hall, also known as Batten Auditorium, after a former moderator of town meeting. We're able to offer a series of 4 free lectures each year, wholly supported by the Isaac Cary Harris, I always get this wrong, the Isaac Harris Cary Fund, which was set up by 2 sisters, Susanna Cary and Ellen Cary Farnham, in 1921 to help educate the townspeople of Lexington. At that time, Lexington was mainly a farming town. They also gave our town this beautiful hall, which is used for many other events, including the Lexington Symphony and town meeting. They belong to a different branch of the same Cary family that gave us our library. So any of you who live in Lexington see the name Cary quite a lot. The lecture tonight is the last in this academic year cycle, but will resume again in the fall of 2024. Please look for our bright golden flyers shortly after Labor Day. And as you know, they are no longer tickets, they are simply informational, so they're worth holding on to. We also have a website, which I have forgotten, but if you type in Cary Lectures Series, it'll come up. Now I have to do my air flight attendant thing, which is to ask you to look at the exits in case of emergency. They are at the back of the hall. This is where I do this, and on the sides. The toilets, in case you haven't noticed, are downstairs. Before I introduce Professor Raj Chetty, who is tonight's speaker, I'd like to thank the director and staff of Cary Library for their steadfast partnership, especially Matt Schumann, whose beautiful posters help publicize our talks. Special thanks as well to the Lexington Times and their ace reporter, Jane Whitehead, for their extensive article on Professor Chetty, to Jonas Miller, Lexington's Director of Communications, for including us in his weekly calendar of events, and as always, to the staff at Batten Auditorium, Cary Hall, especially to Carl Fito and Vincent Leroux for their long, patient hours working with us. And I'm stuttering over the names because I always stutter. We're grateful to LexMedia, who are recording this talk tonight, and they tell me that it will be available by Wednesday for people who are not in the hall. So if you know anyone who wants to see it that way, let them know, please. All right, now to introduce our speaker today. Professor Chetty has been a prodigy from the beginning. He graduated from Harvard in 3 years, earned his PhD in another 3, which is really amazing, was a tenured professor at 28, and after stints at Berkeley and Stanford is back at Harvard, where he's the William A. Ackman Professor of Public Economics. He's won a MacArthur Genius Award and the John Bates Clark Medal, awarded to an economist under 40. He was 34 at the time. What's particularly impressive, though, is that he's using his talents to investigate some of America's greatest problems, which I hope is what's brought you all here tonight. Inequity of opportunity, inequality of income and housing, and the huge gaps in education and future prospects among children who grow up in different neighborhoods. His devotion to these issues may come in part from his own experience, and perhaps we'll learn more about that. For the past near decade, he and his colleagues at Harvard and at partner institutions have had access to 20 million anonymous IRS records from 1996 to 2012. From these data, they've constructed a variety of maps of inequality in the US. They have engaged with regions and cities based on these maps and have been able to see patterns and reach conclusions, I'm sorry if you get this feedback, that you'll hear more about tonight. I don't think I'm overstepping when I say that they hope that this research will lead to groundbreaking change in our country. Their work showing that standardized tests level the admissions playing field has been cited quite recently in the decision by some universities, including Harvard, to reinstate the SAT after the pandemic. Professor Chetty is Director of Opportunity Insights, an institute that focuses on inequality, particularly in relation to the education of children. Its policy recommendations are based not on chance or opinion, but on the big data that's the basis of their research. It's a pleasure for the Cary Lecture Committee to welcome Professor Raj Chetty to Lexington.
Thanks so much, Rita, for the very warm introduction. Can you all hear me okay? Great. So it's really a pleasure to be with you all this evening. Thank you for taking the time to come out on a Saturday evening. And it's a special treat for me to be here in Lexington, a community that I think plays a big role in the way I think about a lot of the issues that I'll talk about tonight. And at a more personal level, nice to be here with Rita's husband, who's my colleague at Harvard, Professor Oliver Hart. When I was an undergraduate, had the opportunity to work with Oliver Hart in a one-on-one reading group, which I don't know if you remember, Oliver had me as a student when I was a sophomore in college. And that was an amazing opportunity to have a Nobel laureate, spending time with you, teaching me issues related to economic theory, things that I was working on. I'm not sure I would have taken myself as a student at that point, but Oliver was kind enough to do that. And it's those kinds of opportunities that I think can really shape people's trajectories. It certainly mattered a great deal for me. And so what I want to talk about this evening is how we can make such opportunities in a broader way available to children across the United States and beyond. And I want to start at a very big picture level by talking about the American dream, which is, of course, a complex concept that means different things to different people. But I want to distill it in this first chart here that I'm going to show you to one aspect, which I think is a cornerstone aspect of the American dream, certainly what drew my own parents to come to this country, and I suspect many of you who are in the audience, the idea that America at least aspires to be a country where through hard work, anyone has the chance to rise up in the income distribution relative to their parents. So in this first chart, I'm showing some data from a paper my colleagues and I wrote a few years ago, where we set about to assess the extent to which America actually lives up to that aspiration. And we measured a very simple statistic. We asked what fraction of children go on to earn more than their parents did, measuring both kids' and parents' incomes in their mid-30s and adjusting for inflation. And we're looking at that data by the year in which the child was born. On the far left, you can see that for kids born back in the middle of the last century, it was a virtual guarantee that you were going to achieve the American dream of moving up. Our estimates showed that 92% of children born in 1940 in America went on to earn more than their parents did. But if you look at what has happened over time, you can see that there's been a dramatic fading of the American dream, such that for children born in the middle of the 1980s, who are turning 30 around now when we're measuring their incomes as adults, it's become essentially a coin flip, a 50-50 shot as to whether you're going to do better than your parents. So this broad trend is, of course, of great interest to economists like myself because it reflects a fundamental change in the US economy that we'd like to understand. But I would argue that this trend is also of fundamental political and social interest because I think it's this very trend that underlies a lot of the frustration that people around the United States are expressing, that this is no longer a country where it's easy to get ahead, even through hard work. And so motivated by that trend, in our research group at Harvard Opportunity Insights, we're interested in that big picture question of what is driving the fading of the American dream, and what can we do going forward to restore the American dream and create greater upward mobility, particularly for kids from lower income families. So we are, of course, by no means the first group of people to be thinking about these issues. There's decades of work by social scientists in multiple disciplines and people in policy circles thinking about issues of inequality and opportunity. What is our new angle on it? What do we hope to contribute to the discussion? We're using the tools of modern big data, to use the Silicon Valley buzzword, to think about these issues. So much as you hear a lot about large-scale data being used in the private sector to improve the products that companies offer, companies like Amazon and Google using large-scale data to make better decisions. Our vision is that analogously, such data can be used to analyze and better understand important economic and social policy questions, and that's what I hope to show you this evening. So why is that sort of data useful? At a simple level, basically what we're going to do and what I'm going to show you in the next few minutes is how we can disaggregate that national picture that I started out with in various dimensions to examine disparities across different types of subgroups, by race, for example, or across different geographic areas, and ultimately use that disaggregation to identify policy solutions by having a sharper lens on what the determinants of economic opportunity are. The starting point for a lot of our analysis, and where I'm going to begin this lecture this evening, is that there are very sharp local differences in rates of upward mobility. So that national picture that I started out with turns out to vary greatly across different communities in America. And so to show you that, let me turn to this slide here, which shows you the geography of opportunity in the United States. So what I'll do is first describe how we construct this map, and then I'll tell you what I think we learn from it. So what we do here is take data, as Rita mentioned in her introduction, on 20 million children born in the United States in the late 1970s and early 1980s, essentially all kids born in the US in that time period. And we link them back to their parents using anonymized data from tax returns covering the entire US population, which our team has built up for research purposes in anonymized form and is working with in various contexts. So we take data on those 20 million kids, get information on their parents' incomes, map them back to the place in which they grew up, and then divide the US into 740 different metro and rural areas. And in each of those areas, we calculate a very simple measure of upward mobility. We ask, what is the average income at age 35 for kids who grew up in low-income families? And for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to define a low-income family as a family at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution, which corresponds to a household income of about $27,000 a year. So the way to think about this map is basically take a bunch of kids who are growing up in families making about $27,000 or $30,000 a year and ask how much are they themselves making as adults when we look at their 1040 tax returns when they file them, right? So for example, in the Boston metro area, you can see that it's a fact, if you look at tax records, that kids who grew up in families making $27,000 a year, in the next generation, when they're in their 30s, they're making about $36,800 a year. Similarly, you can construct that statistic for all of the other metro and rural areas in the US, and we color the map so that blue-green colors represent areas with higher levels of upward mobility, where you're more likely to achieve the American dream, and red-orange colors represent areas with lower levels of upward mobility. So if you look at the scale here on the lower right-hand side of this chart, the first point I want to make is that there's an enormous amount of variation in children's chances of rising up in different parts of America, even in the present day. So there's some parts of the US, like if you look at much of the center of the country, where your odds of rising up look terrific, even if you're starting out in a low-income family. So look at a place like Dubuque, Iowa, for example. Kids starting out in families making $27,000 a year, on average, are making $45,000 or even $50,000 a year in the next generation, which is a substantial amount of upward mobility in a single generation. In contrast, if you look at a place like Charlotte, North Carolina, kids starting out in families at that exact same income level, $27,000 a year, are actually making less than their parents were one generation later, which is remarkable when you think about the amount of economic growth that has occurred in America over the past 30 years, and in places like Charlotte in particular. Now you can see the broad regional patterns for yourself. Much of the Southeast, cities in the industrial Midwest like Cleveland and Cincinnati and so on have very low rates of upward mobility. Parts of the Midwest and parts of the coast have significantly higher levels of upward mobility. Now this map, I think, is of interest to us for two reasons. First, from a scientific point of view, it gives us a new lens to study the science of economic opportunity. We can start to ask questions like, what's different about Dubuque, Iowa, or Salt Lake City relative to a place like Charlotte or Atlanta, where we see much lower levels of economic mobility? What happens when someone moves from one of these places to another place Do they start to pick up that higher level of mobility that we see in some of these other areas? We can start to understand the causal determinants of children's life chances in terms of rising up. So that's the scientific motivation. But I also think there's a very important policy motivation, because if we can understand the science of economic opportunity, then we can start to make changes in policy, perhaps changing the design of systems of education or affordable housing policies or things like that in some of these red-colored areas, thereby increasing economic opportunity there and working towards restoring the American dream more broadly. So motivated by that logic, the way that I'm going to structure this talk this evening is in two parts. First, I'm going to tell you what we've learned in our team and now through research of many other scholars in the past decade or so about the science of economic opportunity, essentially walking through a series of explanations for what might be driving the variation in this map. You might already have some in your mind, and we're just going to systematically test a series of different hypotheses in the data. And then in the second part of the talk, I'll transition towards taking that set of research findings and showing you what we can do from a policy perspective to actually change things on the ground and increase upward mobility going forward. So let's start with the first hypothesis that often comes to the mind of economists or people in business. Maybe this is about differences in the types of jobs that are available in different areas. If you take, for example, the Bay Area, we all know the tech sector has been booming in the last 30 years. Maybe the Bay Area has relatively high rates of upward mobility because there are good jobs there, and so kids who grew up in that area end up doing relatively well. So to evaluate that hypothesis, let's turn to this chart here, where on the vertical axis, I'm going to put the data from the map that I just showed you, rates of upward mobility for kids who grew up in low-income families, the average amounts that they earn in adulthood, here focusing on the 30 largest cities in America. And what we're going to do is correlate that with, on the horizontal axis, job growth rates from 1990 to 2010, the period over which the kids in the sample were growing up. So the idea here is that the cities on the far right side of this chart are places that are booming, where there are many more jobs, or you can use other measures like many high-paying jobs. So take an example like Charlotte or Atlanta. These are some of the fastest growing cities in America. They're viewed as the engine of jobs in the Southeast. If you were to drive around Charlotte today versus 30 years ago, it would be totally obvious to you that the city's gotten much richer. There are many more high-paying jobs, many successful companies, and so on. Yet, as you can see here, if you look at our longitudinal data, where we're following the kids who grew up in low-income families in Charlotte over time, you can see that Charlotte actually ranks lowest among the largest American cities in terms of rates of upward mobility. So the fact that Charlotte is very rapidly growing apparently is not translating into better outcomes for the kids who grew up in Charlotte itself in the long run. So you might first ask, how is that even possible? If you take repeated snapshots of data, you see that Charlotte is getting richer over time. But if you look longitudinally at a given set of people growing up in Charlotte, they don't seem to be doing better. So how does that add up? The way I think about it is that places like Charlotte and Atlanta are basically importing talent. Lots of people move to cities like Charlotte, where, for example, Bank of America is headquartered, and get jobs at high-paying finance firms. But what we see in the longitudinal data is that those jobs are not going to the kids growing up in Charlotte itself, in particular from low and middle-income families. Now, the implication of that very simple point is that while jobs obviously matter in the economy as a whole to give people higher levels of income, they are not the answer in and of themselves in terms of why we're seeing such differences in rates of upward mobility across areas. Simply having more jobs in a given place, trying to get the Amazon headquarters to move to your city, for example, it might be useful for other reasons, but in terms of creating greater upward mobility for the people in your area, it doesn't necessarily translate one for one, as you can see from the fact that there's basically no relationship in this plot between job growth rates and rates of upward mobility. So what that suggests is that we need to take a more deliberate approach in terms of building human capital, to use the term that economists would use, or basically building skills, equipping people with the skills to get those high-paying jobs. It doesn't happen automatically simply if we have more jobs in an area. Okay, so that was the first possible hypothesis, that maybe this is about differences in jobs. That doesn't quite seem to be the answer. So let's go back to the big map here and think about a different hypothesis, this time coming from demography rather than economics. Anyone familiar with the demographic structure of the United States would recognize that there's a potential connection to race here. In particular, the red and orange colored parts of the map tend to be the places with larger African American populations. We all know that there's a long history of racial disparities in America, and so you might wonder how much of the difference that we're seeing in this map across places is actually about differences across races in terms of levels of upward mobility. So to get at that, what we did next is link the data from the tax records, which give us information on everyone's incomes, to information from the census, which gives us data on everyone's race and ethnicity in the United States. And so that allows us to construct this pair of maps here, showing you the same statistics that I showed you before, but separately now for black men on the left and white men on the right. Now, when you first look at these two maps, your reaction might be, oh, they've put these maps on two different color scales, kind of a red-orange color scale on the left and a green-yellow color scale on the right. But you can see that, in fact, we have not done that. If you look at the bottom of the slide, the color scale is the same across the two maps. It's just that there's such an extreme difference in rates of upward mobility between black men and white men that it's almost like you're living in two different countries in terms of economic opportunity. To put it a little bit more precisely, what you have here is basically a situation with non-overlapping distributions. The very best places in terms of upward mobility for a black man, a place like Boston, for example, where a black man growing up in a low-income family can expect to earn about $25,000 a year on average, they have worse outcomes there than the very worst places for upward mobility for white men, a place like Charlotte, North Carolina, for example, where white men can expect to earn on average about $25,000 a year. So in that sense, the set of opportunities available to black men in America is just completely distinct from the set of opportunities available to white men. There's no understating the importance of race, even conditional on class, in the present day in the United States. That's absolutely clear in the data. Now, you'll notice when I started to cut the data by race, I also began to cut the data by gender, showing you the map specifically for black versus white men. Why did I do that? Turns out if you construct the exact same pair of maps for black women and white women, you see a very different pattern. The spectrum of colors is basically the same in the map on the left and the map on the right, showing you that there are not really large differences in rates of upward mobility between black and white women. And in fact, if you look at a variety of different measures, levels of college completion, other measures of employment, and so on, black women and white women have pretty similar outcomes, pretty similar levels of mobility, conditional on the income of the family in which they grew up. Very different from the picture we saw for black men versus white men. So that's useful to know because, as you know, there's a lot of discussion about racial disparities. What these data clearly reveal is that those differences emerge in a way that interacts with gender. So the racial disparities in America, are really rooted in the lack of opportunity for black men. Now, why is that? It might make you think about certain types of explanations, could be related to mass incarceration and criminal justice issues that particularly affect black men, for example, could be related to discrimination in the labor market that's somehow particularly limiting opportunities for black men. We don't necessarily know exactly what the answer is yet, but I think it's very useful to understand that pattern in thinking about what might matter going forward. Okay, so we've identified that race seems to be an important determinant of economic opportunity. That being said, I want to stress that even conditional on race, if you look at the map on the right, there's still an enormous amount of difference across places in terms of people's outcomes for people in a given racial group. So if you look at white women, for example, there's still a lot of variation in outcomes across areas. So race matters, but place still seems to matter conditional on race. So why is that? So to go deeper into that, what our team did next is to think about these differences not just at this broad regional level where your eye tends to focus on the Northeast versus the Midwest and the coasts and so on, but if you look back at the prior literature in sociology, for example, the way people would talk about the role of place is not at the level of cities or at the level of municipalities and things like that, but at the neighborhood level. And if you think about it intuitively, all of you living here in Lexington, If you're thinking about the community that might influence your outcomes, you think about the local schools, you think about your neighbors, it's at a much more granular level that you might think these things are playing out. So what we did next is construct the same sorts of maps at a much finer geographic level. And to show you that, I'm going to toggle over to this website that's not showing up there. So let me just, give me 1 second to pull that up. I think I might need to exit. You just give me 1 second. Let's see if this works. Yeah, there we go. So here's this website, opportunityatlas.org, which you can access yourself if you just type the Opportunity Atlas. So we're starting out with this same view that I was showing you before of statistics on upward mobility across different parts of the US. But the way this works is very much like a Google map. You can type in any address you want. And so I'm going to just type in Lexington, given where we are. And we're going to literally zoom in and now see these statistics at a much finer geographic level, in particular at the census tract level, neighborhood by neighborhood here in Boston. I'm just going to zoom out a bit so we have a little bit of context. And so what you can see is the exact same statistics that I was showing you before, but now across these census tracts in the Boston area. So what are census tracts? There's 70,000 census tracts in America, each of which has 4,000 people. So this is giving you a very fine definition of neighborhoods where you can see that, you know, different parts of Boston, within Cambridge, within the city of Boston, and so on, are disaggregated into these small neighborhoods. Now, the statistics are exactly the same. We're taking the set of families with relatively low levels of income and asking how well their kids do on average. So the first simple point I want to make is that if you just look within the Boston metro area, the spectrum of colors that you're seeing in this map is the same as the spectrum of colors that you saw on the national map that we started out with. So we haven't changed the color scale here. So what is that telling you? You can drive 2 miles down the road in Boston, and it's like you're going from Alabama to Iowa in terms of your kids' chances of rising up in terms of rates of upward mobility, showing you that the origins of these differences in rates of economic mobility are hyper-local. It's not about differences across states or differences across cities in terms of the policies they might have. It's about differences in terms of what's happening on one side of the street versus another side of the street, or in one school district versus another school district. The origins of these differences are very granular, which makes you think about a certain set of possible explanations and determinants, things that are operating at a very local level. Now, when you look at these data, I think some of the patterns probably strike you as pretty intuitive. So in particular, if you look at Lexington, you can see that Lexington's a place where kids have terrific outcomes on average, as you might expect intuitively. That's true for much of the western suburbs in Massachusetts, the more affluent parts of the Boston metro area. And then when you get more into the city, and in particular, if you get to the south side of Boston, you know, you get to places like Roxbury and so on, the rates of upward mobility you see there look comparable to what you see in the lowest upward mobility places in the United States. And so at some level, those patterns are intuitive, but then there are also other patterns that may not have been as obvious to you ex ante. So take a place like Malden, for example, or Everett, which you would not necessarily think of ex ante, I think, as a super affluent community. If you look at average levels of income, they look considerably lower in Malden and Everett relative to a place like Lexington or Newton. But you can see that kids' outcomes in places like Malden and Melrose and Everett and Revere actually look quite good. Rates of upward mobility in those places are excellent. And so what that shows you is these data can reveal something about these drivers of upward mobility, some of which we may have, we may capture intuitively in relation to things like poverty rates and the quality of schools, but there are other dimensions that we may not fully understand. And that's the sense in which being able to see the data at this level of granularity, here I've given you an example from Boston, but of course you can do this across the United States, and you can look at that on this website, that can potentially teach us at this local level what the determinants of opportunity are. And so motivated by that, I'm going to use this very local variation now to get a finer sense of what is driving these differences in upward mobility across areas. So as a first step, and I'm just going to toggle back to the slides. As a first step toward doing that, I'm going to first give you an example from the New York City area. Here's a snapshot of the Opportunity Atlas in the New York City area, where we once again see this pattern of very sharp differences in upward mobility across different neighborhoods. And what I'm going to do as a step towards trying to understand what's driving that variation in New York or in Boston or in general is tell you now about a study where we look at families that move across different neighborhoods. That's going to give us some insight into why these neighborhoods have such different impacts on kids' long-term outcomes. So we've done an analysis where we look at 5 million families that move across census tracts with kids of different ages. Rather than getting into the statistical details of that study, I'm going to summarize what we find in the context of a simple example. So it turns out in the New York City area, there's a part of New York called Brownsville, where there's a street called Dumont Avenue, where north of that street, there's a public housing project called the Van Dyke Public Housing Project, one of the biggest public housing projects in New York City, where if you look at kids who grow up in low-income families, and if you were to type that into the Opportunity Atlas, you would see that kids who grow up in low-income families there have average incomes in adulthood of only something like $18,000 a year. So exceptionally poor outcomes. And you have very high rates of incarceration, very low employment rates, a suite of really challenging outcomes. Why am I giving you that example? It turns out if you look on the south side of Dumont Avenue, there's another place called the Nehemiah Houses, which is a mixed income housing development developed by a congregation in the 1980s, where if you look at kids with the exact same racial background, same parental income, and look at their average incomes in adulthood, it's more like $27,000 or $30,000 a year. So they're doing considerably better than the kids who grew up just on the north side of the street. Why do I give you that particular example? Turns out when we put the study out publicly a few years ago, NPR did some investigative reporting focusing on that particular example, and they talked to a bunch of families who had moved from the Van Dyke houses to the Nehemiah houses and talked about how their experience had completely changed and so on. So I want to generalize from that example and ask you to think about a set of families who move with their kids from the Van Dyke Public Housing Project to the Nehemiah houses. As I mentioned before, the kids who grew up in the Van Dyke Public Housing Project from birth have average earnings in adulthood of about $17,000 a year, and the kids who grew up from birth in the Nehemiah houses have considerably higher earnings. So now let's imagine a set of kids who move at age 2 from the Van Dyke houses to the Nehemiah houses, or more generally, from a blue-green colored part of the maps that I've been showing you, from a red colored part of the maps that I've been showing you to a blue-green colored part, to a higher opportunity area. And what we see here is that kids who made that particular move, if we track them forward 30 years in the tax data, their average earnings in adulthood are about $25,000 a year, okay? So that's for the kids who made this move when they're exactly 2 years old. Now let's repeat this analysis, looking at children who move when they're 3, 4, 5, and so on, who make that exact same move. What you see is a very clear declining pattern. The later you move from the Van Dyke houses to the Nehemiah houses, or more generally from a red-colored part of the map that I've been showing to a green-colored part, the less of a gain you get. And if you move after you're in your early 20s, the relationship becomes completely flat, and there's no gain at all. So what do you see from this chart? I think there are 3 key takeaways. The first is that where you grow up, the environment in which you grow up, really matters for your life outcomes. It's not just that the types of kids who are living in the public housing project are different from the kids living on the other side of the street, or the kids living in Charlotte are different from the kids living in Salt Lake City. Apparently, if you take a given kid and move that kid to a different environment at a young age, they have fundamentally different life outcomes. So I view that as an incredibly encouraging result, because it suggests that to create more economic mobility in this country or elsewhere, you don't need to look back to the 1940s and the 1950s. No, you can actually look a few miles down the road, and if you had people growing up in that different environment, they would have really different outcomes. So that suggests this problem is actually changeable. And we just need to figure out what it is that's driving these differences. So the second thing you see is that what really matters is where you grow up, not where you live as an adult. We find this in this study and many other studies. Really, environment seems to matter up to something like age 22 or 23, and beyond that, at least the neighborhood context, the set of people you're interacting with, and so on, seems to have less influence on people's economic trajectories. And the third thing that you see is that there's a dosage pattern, to make a medical analogy. Every extra year that you spend growing up in a high opportunity community, a place like Lexington, for example, the better your outcomes look in adulthood. But what I will stress here is that dosage is pretty uniform throughout childhood. So many of you might know that there's a lot of discussion these days about early childhood intervention, things like universal preschool, Head Start programs, things like that. Our sense is those programs can be quite valuable, but that doesn't mean that environment doesn't matter at later ages. Even if you move to a better place when you're 10 instead of 15 or 15 instead of 20, you can still gain quite a lot. So environment matters throughout childhood, not just in the earliest years, which is, I think, an important lesson in terms of thinking about policy interventions going forward. Okay, so having identified that neighborhoods seem to have a causal effect on kids' long-term outcomes through this dosage effect, naturally the next question is, what is it that some of these communities that generate very high rates of upward mobility are doing that's different from the places where we see much poorer outcomes? What's the recipe for high rates of upward mobility? So that's a very active area of research. It's a very challenging question to answer, and there are many, many studies that have been done or in progress thinking about these questions. I'm going to summarize here, in the interest of time, the 4 strongest patterns that people have identified to date as predictors of these differences in economic opportunity. What are the characteristics of places that produce high levels of upward mobility? So the first is that those kinds of places tend to have lower poverty rates. So you saw that very clearly, right, in the map of Boston that I showed. The places that had the highest levels of upward mobility, the green-colored places on the map, tend to be the more affluent parts of the city. More generally, more mixed income communities, in the opposite of the public housing project example that I gave, which tends to concentrate poverty in a particular place. Integration, where we have low-income people living in proximity to high-income people, those kinds of places give better opportunities for upward mobility. A second strong pattern in the data is that places with more stable family structures, more two-parent families in particular, tend to have systematically higher rates of upward mobility. Third, as you might expect intuitively, places with better schools, both at the K through 12 level and in terms of access to higher education, tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. And finally, places with greater social capital tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. Now, this idea of social capital, I want to spend a little bit more time on it. It's an idea that's been discussed in the social sciences, in the public discourse for more than 100 years. People have meant things like the strength of your community, who you're connected to, what your networks look like, might be very relevant for determining a variety of life outcomes. Some of you might be familiar, for example, with the work of our Harvard colleague, Bob Putnam, who popularized the idea of social capital in his well-known book, Bowling Alone, where he talks about how who you interact with and having a sense of community might matter for long-term outcomes. Now, social capital, like a number of other concepts that I think seem intuitively important and have been the subject of much discussion, is the type of thing that's has been traditionally very difficult to measure, and especially to measure on scale, to try to understand exactly what do we mean by social capital, what type of social capital matters, and so on. So I want to show you here some work our team has done recently in a pair of papers published in Nature, where we set up a collaboration with Meta, the company that operates the Facebook platform, to measure social capital on an unprecedented scale, again, using the tools of big data, and start to get a sharper sense of why and how social capital might matter for economic mobility. So to show you that analysis, I'm going to compare 2 maps. The map on the left is the map that I've shown you several times now in this talk. It's just the map of upward mobility based on tax record data. The map on the right is a completely different map. Here we're using data on 70 million people who are on Facebook, everyone on Facebook between the ages of 25 and 44 in the United States, which comprises about 85% of the US population in that age range, because most people in that age range tend to be on Facebook. And what we're doing is using a machine learning algorithm to predict everyone's incomes, and we're asking what fraction of your friends on Facebook tend to be above median income if you have below median income. So if you're a low-income person, what fraction of your friends are high income, county by county in America? In the map on the right, the green colors are places where low-income people have more high-income friends, so there's more cross-class interaction as measured by these Facebook data. And the red colors are places with more disconnection across class lines, where low-income people do not have very many high-income friends. And you can see the result for yourself. It's totally obvious. Those two maps look incredibly similar to each other. Places with more economic connectedness, more cross-class interaction, tend to be precisely the places that have higher levels of economic mobility across generations. This turns out to be the single strongest correlation we or anyone else working on these issues has identified. And it turns out to explain a number of the other patterns, the other correlations that people have identified in prior research. So our sense is this social connectedness across class lines seems to be an extremely important determinant of upward mobility. Now, why is that? Again, I don't think we quite know yet. We and others are doing quite a bit of work to try to figure that out. But I think there's several intuitive hypotheses and mechanisms that could be underlying this. So one simple one is that many jobs in America are obtained through referrals. So if you live in a place where you're more connected to high-income people who have good jobs, maybe you're more likely to get that internship or get that job that puts you on a better trajectory. But I think at a deeper level, and probably even more importantly, our sense is that these types of connections might shape people's aspirations. So if you're a kid growing up in a community where nobody's gone to college, nobody's become a scientist, nobody's become a professional, maybe that's just not on your radar screen. It's just not the type of career path you even think about pursuing. But if you live in a community where you're connected to people who have done those things, maybe it changes what you think is possible, changes what you choose to invest in, and changes kids' life trajectories. So whatever the underlying mechanism is, it seems like there's a really strong link between this particular measure of social capital, cross-class interaction, and rates of upward mobility, and that seems like a key factor to keep in mind as we think about how to intervene to increase social mobility going forward. So having now shown you a set of different research findings in a very brief overview here, but given you a sense of what the determinants of economic opportunity are, what I want to do in the remaining time is talk about how we can take that set of findings in order to inform policy to increase economic mobility going forward. So just to summarize in a nutshell what I think we've learned from a decade of research on these issues, a very simple summary would be that rates of economic opportunity are shaped in a very granular way by the environment in which you grow up, the neighborhood in which you grow up, the specific community in which you grow up, and a variety of different factors matter, from childhood to something like age 22 or 23, things like social capital, the schools you attend, and so on. So if you have that worldview, if you have that theory of the world of how outcomes are determined, of what determines social mobility, I think you would naturally think about three different ways to increase economic opportunity going forward. The first is to reduce segregation. If we know that there are better opportunities a few miles down the road in Boston, maybe we can give more people access to those opportunities by building affordable housing, by changing zoning laws, by creating more integration in our cities. So that's one possibility. Now, that approach is not going to be entirely scalable. Think of that as like a moving to opportunity approach. You can't move everyone. Not everyone wants to move. So I think ultimately, we also need to think about a different strategy, which is what I'm going to call place-based investment. How do we make investments to turn the red-colored neighborhoods into green-colored neighborhoods in the maps that I've been showing you? And then a final approach, recognizing that the key touch point for most kids after age 18 is not the neighborhood or the home in which you grow up, but the college that you attend. I think that there's a lot more that we can do to make our institutions of higher education more effective in promoting upward mobility. So let me spend a few minutes talking about each of these three different approaches and what we've learned on the policy front and what people are doing to create change on the ground before concluding. Okay, so let's start with the reducing segregation approach. Here, I'm going to show you now a different snapshot from the Opportunity Atlas, taking you to Seattle, where our team has been doing some work, where we see that familiar checkered pattern that I showed you in Boston, that I showed you in New York. There's some parts of Seattle where kids have much better chances of rising up than others. What we're doing now is overlaying in the bright green dots the places where people receiving housing vouchers from the federal government currently live. As a bit of institutional context, in the US, we spend about $45 billion per year on affordable housing programs, the largest component of which are called housing choice vouchers, which about 2 million or 2.5 million families get in the form of basically rental assistance to find housing in a better area, to find more stable housing. In Seattle, that rental assistance is worth about $1,500 a month. So think of that as just getting assistance to find housing worth $1,500 a month. Now, you might notice a puzzling pattern with these green dots, which is that they are concentrated in the red and orange colored parts of the map, not the blue-green colored parts of the map, where we've seen, based on the work that I showed you, people are much more likely to break the cycle of poverty across generations. So despite the fact that we're spending billions of dollars giving families assistance to try to help them break the cycle of poverty, if you actually look at where these families are living, they're living in places where we actually think poverty is very likely to be perpetuated across generations. So when we put these data out publicly, a number of housing authorities across the US and the Housing and Urban Development Agency approached us and said, why do we see this strange pattern that we're trying to do a lot to support families, yet they actually don't seem to be using this money to move to better areas? So out of that came a collaboration called the Creating Moves to Opportunity experiment, which we set up in partnership with the Seattle and King County housing authorities, where we decided to basically go about and test why it is that families are not moving to these high opportunity places with their vouchers, and in particular, whether there might be a set of barriers that they're facing in making such moves that could potentially be addressed and maybe make the program much more effective. So the way we set this up is as a randomized trial, very much like you would run a randomized trial in medicine or in testing the efficacy of a drug. So here, what we did is took 1,000 families that came in through the regular process to apply for a housing voucher, split them into two groups. 500 of them just got the voucher and were offered an opportunity to search for housing wherever they wanted. That's the control group. And then the treatment group, we gave them some additional assistance. I think of it as basically a social capital sort of intervention to connect them with people and with resources that might assist them in the process of housing search. So in particular, this included customized counseling. So think of it as basically a broker who helps you find an apartment in a high opportunity area, someone who would look up listings for you, drive you around, say, here's a place I found that would work for your job, for your family, and I think you could get in there. They also would connect people with landlords to help them in the negotiation process, often a fraught experience for families, especially from lower income backgrounds who may not be able to convince landlords to rent to them. And then they also provided a little bit of short-term financial assistance to pay an application fee or a security deposit that these families might not have in hand. Okay, so this intervention is not cheap. It costs about $2,500 per family. But to put that in context, let me remind you that we're giving these families currently $1,500 a month for many, many years of rental assistance. On average, the typical family receives about $100,000 over the course over the months during which they're getting the housing voucher. So relative to that $100,000 expense that we already have, this is about a 2% incremental expense. So it's not an enormously expensive thing to do. So we evaluate the effectiveness of this type of social capital intervention, basically a little bit of support in using the financial resources that you're already getting, using this randomized trial. And since it's a randomized trial, you can just follow people over time and see what happens, see where they choose to move. And here's the result. In the control group, 14% of families move to high upward mobility areas as defined by our Opportunity Atlas area, so the green colored part of the map of Seattle that I was showing you. In the treatment group, that number jumps up to 55%. More than half of these families now move to high opportunity places. And just to give you a sense of the importance of these moves, we estimate based on our prior work that these kids who by chance got randomized into the treatment group and moved to one of these high opportunity places, by the flip of a coin, they are now going to go on to earn about $200,000 more over their lifetimes than the kids in the control group who didn't have those opportunities. So that $2,500 often ask me, when you do this research, especially in these polarized times, it's great. Fact, in terms of what politicians decide to do, does this actually advance policy? And I've actually been quite encouraged to see how a clear presentation of evidence can indeed make a difference. So just to give you an example of that, after we did that work in Seattle, there was a bill passed in Congress called the Housing Choice Voucher Mobility Demonstration Act, co-sponsored by a Republican and Democratic senator, that authorized $80 million to replicate what we did in Seattle in 8 other cities across America. That demonstration in those 8 other cities is currently happening. But much more importantly, there's now been another bill introduced in Congress, again with a Republican and Democratic sponsor, I think actually giving it a shot of passing at some point in the coming years, which proposes to expand the housing voucher program by $5 billion per year. And if you read the language of that bill, hews very closely to the lessons we've learned from the research. So what they suggest is targeting these vouchers at families with young kids, where you have the biggest dosage effects, providing additional support in the process of housing search so that people actually end up in these higher opportunity neighborhoods, and so on. And if that bill is passed, I think that could have an impact on thousands of kids' lives across the United States and take a step towards creating more opportunity. Okay, so a bit more briefly now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that we think moving to opportunity or these housing voucher programs, or there could be other variants of it, building affordable housing in certain communities, as I understand is being discussed here in Lexington, or changing zoning laws. I think all of that can make a difference, but it's obviously not entirely scalable. That's not going to be the way we restore the American dream simply with that set of policies. I think it's very important to think about, in parallel to that, how you turn low opportunity places into high opportunity places. Now, that is a very challenging thing to do, and I don't think from a scientific point of view we have the answer yet on how to do that. But I want to give you a feel for how communities across the US are thinking about how to tackle these questions. And so to do that, I'm going to take you back to Charlotte, where I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, our team put out a study a few years ago showing that Charlotte ranks 50th out of the 50 largest American cities in terms of rates of upward mobility. So I think the reaction there is informative and was quite interesting and inspiring to me. So the local newspaper wrote an article about that. Charlotte ranked 50th out of 50. How can we be ranked dead last in terms of upward mobility despite thinking ourselves as a thriving city? And they really did a lot to try to raise awareness about this issue. So you can see, for example, the local basketball team, the Charlotte Hornets, had a night of one of the games in their season with jerseys that said 50 out of 50, raising awareness about economic mobility. They set up a local task force and a commission to try to figure out what they can do to try to improve opportunity in the city for kids growing up in low-income families there. And what came out of that, I thought was interesting, is not just discussion of these issues, but some actual action on a number of different dimensions. So over the past 7 or 8 years, there's been more than $195 million invested by various nonprofits to try to increase economic mobility in Charlotte. These are things like mentorship programs, pre-K readiness programs, a variety of different programs. We don't know exactly which of these is going to be effective yet. I don't think we have that scientific understanding, but there are many, many efforts to try to make a change. There have also been interesting changes in the private sector. So as one example, Bank of America, which I mentioned earlier is headquartered in Charlotte, they recognized that while they were bringing jobs to Charlotte, they weren't employing people growing up in disadvantaged communities in Charlotte itself. So they made a commitment to hire 1,000 kids who grew up in disadvantaged families in Charlotte. And they recognized that there was a reason that they weren't hiring those kids to begin with. They didn't feel that they were qualified in terms of the preparation and skills they had. So to remedy that, they teamed up with a group called Year Up, which is a nonprofit based here in Boston, that provides a 1-year job training program that essentially tries to equip people with the skills needed to get these jobs, like the ones that Bank of America is advertising. And the idea is that Year Up provides that training, Bank of America has the jobs waiting for these kids and an internship and so on. And that's something that's going to, on a significant scale, at least for those 1,000 people, change the trajectory of their lives. And then there were a number of other changes, like local policy changes in terms of affordable housing, zoning laws, and so on. Now, again, we don't yet know whether this is going to work or which of these things are most effective in turning a low opportunity place into a high opportunity place. But just to give you a sense of, how I think this can matter, here's an example from another randomized trial of this Year Up program using earlier data, where we're tracking the earnings of people who participated in Year Up, this 1-year job training program in the green, and in the orange, a set of people who were eligible for the program and applied for it, but didn't get the opportunity to participate in the program. And what we've done is link that data to tax record data to track these people's earnings over time. And you can see that after you participate in that program, which is marked by 0, you have about a 35% increase in your earnings that's sustained for many, many years. And so that kind of evidence shows you that when we target these efforts at these lower opportunity communities, we may meaningfully be able to change the trajectory of many kids' lives living in those places. So there's much more work to be done in this space, and our team is spending a lot of time focusing on these issues. But I'm hopeful, based on this sort of evidence, that we can actually turn some of the lower opportunity communities in Boston into places that offer better prospects for upward mobility. Finally, let me come to the third and last bucket here on policy, which is the role of higher education. And I think some of this might be relevant, especially for some of the parents or students here in the audience who are very focused on issues of higher education and getting into colleges and things like that. So let me spend a few minutes on that before wrapping up. So to frame that discussion, let me start with this chart here. So just like our team has constructed statistics on economic mobility for every neighborhood in America, we've also made publicly available data on every college's contribution to economic mobility in America. And you can, showing that in this chart here, you can look this up for any college of interest in a nice tool that the New York Times has put together if you'd like. So the way this chart works is that every college in America is represented by a dot, and we're showing 2 key axes that matter for a college's contribution to economic mobility. On the vertical axis is what we're calling the upward mobility rate. Think of this as what a college does in terms of helping children rise from the bottom to the top. So specifically what we're measuring here is taking the set of children who start out in families in the bottom fifth of the income distribution and asking what fraction of those kids reach the top fifth of the income distribution. So in some sense, what fraction of the student body of a given college achieves the American dream? And you can see that colleges that many of you are familiar with, places like Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, Yale, and so on, look terrific on that dimension. Most of the kids who start out, even in low-income families who attend those colleges, end up reaching the upper middle class or beyond. But of course, a college's contribution to economic mobility depends not just on how well its low-income students do, but how many low-income students you actually have on campus to begin with. And that's what's shown on the horizontal axis. What fraction of the students at these colleges come from low-income families, come from the bottom 20%. And you can see on that dimension, places like Princeton and Stanford and Harvard don't look so great. They have very few kids from the bottom fifth of the income distribution. About 3% of children come from the bottom 20% of the income distribution. Another statistic that I think gives you a sense is that you're about 80 times more likely to attend Harvard if you're from the top 1% of the income distribution, a family making more than $600,000 a year, relative to the bottom 20% of the income distribution. So these colleges, it is a fact, serve very few low-income kids, and as a result, just arithmetically cannot be contributing a whole lot to economic mobility. If you're not educating that many low-income children, obviously you can't be helping a lot of children rise up. And so, that's one end of the spectrum where we see excellent outcomes, but very limited access. But then you can see on the other end of the spectrum here, you have a number of community colleges, typically 2-year colleges, that educate lots of low-income kids. So there's a lot of access. But if you look at where those dots fall on the vertical axis, we don't see great outcomes there. We don't see kids doing particularly well after attending a number of those institutions. And so one way to conceptualize what the problem is in the US higher education system in terms of economic mobility is that the upper right side of this chart is basically empty. We don't have any colleges in America that both educate a lot of kids from low-income backgrounds and offer great outcomes after college. That's the fundamental problem. And so seeing the problem in that way, you basically think about two different types of solutions. Very mechanically, how do you move those dots on the upper left to the right? How do you expand access to colleges that currently deliver great outcomes? And how do you move the dots that are on the lower right here upward? How do you improve outcomes at the places that currently offer good access? And we and others are doing work on both of these dimensions. I'm going to focus on the former, partly because we know a little bit more about it, having made more progress scientifically, and partly because I think it may be particularly relevant for the audience here. And so I'm going to talk about a study that we released last year, which Rita alluded to in her introduction, talking about the SAT and so on, where what we did, and actually one of the students who worked on this study, Arjun Shanmugam, is here in the audience with us and is on our team. What we all did in this study is linked data on SAT and ACT scores for everyone in America to the tax records that our team is working with. And we also got data on college admissions, so the internal admissions files of students who applied to many different colleges in America, about 400 different colleges, and linked that to the tax record. So we can see, say, for example, someone who applied to a college like Yale, did they get in or not? What was in their application file? What did their recommendation letters look like? And so on. What determines whether you get in? So I'm going to show you a couple of results from that data that I think will give you a sense of why those dots were on the upper left, why elite private colleges in America are so inaccessible to kids from low-income families, and may suggest some ways to change that going forward, which connects to the types of things you're seeing in the news these days about what colleges are changing. Okay, so first basic fact. So what we're plotting here is what are your odds, what's your chance of admission to what we're going to call an Ivy Plus college. So the 8 Ivy League institutions, as well as Harvard, Stanford, Duke, and MIT. So 12 highly selective private colleges in America, all clustered in the upper left side of that chart. Plot your chances of being admitted by parent income, controlling for your SAT scores. So critically, what we're doing here is think of it as taking a set of kids, all of whom scored, say, 1,500 out of 1,600 on the SAT, and ask, what are your chances of being admitted to, say, Harvard by your parent income? And what you can see here is kind of a U shape where kids in particular from what I'd call the upper middle class, between the 70th percentile and about the 97th, 98th percentile. So that's an income range of roughly, say, 80,000 to something like 250,000. Those kids tend to have the lowest chances of getting in, conditional on their SAT scores. And then there's a spike upward at the very top, where if you're from families in the top 1%, and especially top 0.1%, families making more than about $600,000 a year or $1 million a year, you have significantly higher chances of getting in, even conditional on having exactly the same SAT scores. So the kids from the richest families in America are basically twice as likely to get in as the kids from middle-class families with the same test score credentials. Okay, so first, just to characterize like the magnitude of that issue, what that means is the typical class, like at a place like Harvard, for example, it has about 1,650 students per class. One way to think about it is that we have an extra 114 students from the top 1% of the income distribution relative to what we would have if those kids were admitted at the same rate as kids from the middle class with comparable SAT scores. Okay, so why is this happening? So one part of it, which you might guess intuitively, is legacy admissions. So one way we can see that is look at what are your odds of getting into these colleges, again, holding fixed your SAT scores. If you are from a family where the parents went to that college, shown in the green bar there, and the parents are from the top 1% of the income distribution, you can see that you have a 44% chance of getting in, which if you think about admissions rates to these colleges, you know that they're relatively low. A 44% chance of getting in is incredibly high. In contrast, if you're from a non-legacy family, you have a 9% chance of getting in. So your odds of getting in are about 5 times higher, holding fixed your SAT scores, if your parents went to that college relative to if they didn't. Now, when you look at these data, sometimes an intuition people have is, okay, maybe part of that is the effect of your parents going to the college itself, but it must also be the case that legacy applicants are better prepared, right? Their parents went to these very prestigious colleges, maybe they're growing up in different types of households, they're going to better schools, they have a better background, et cetera. Maybe that's why they're getting in at higher rates, and all of that's not captured in their SAT scores. So as a way to assess that, a sharp way to assess that, is to exploit the fact that we have data here on multiple different Ivy League colleges. So you can basically ask the question, if your parents went to Stanford, are you more likely to get into Yale? Because if it really was that you were better prepared, you would think that if your parents went to Stanford, you should also have a better chance of getting into Yale or Princeton, right? And so what we can do is ask whether admissions rates at other Ivy League colleges are related to whether your parents were legacies at a given Ivy League college. And it turns out the answer is absolutely not. Your chances of getting it at other Ivy League colleges are totally unrelated to whether your parents went to a given Ivy League college, which really makes it look like it is a direct legacy preference. It's not actually about differences in preparation. So that turns out to be one part of what's driving the advantage for kids from very high income families, because legacy applicants tend to be very high income themselves. Another important piece of it is what we call non-academic ratings, things like extracurriculars, personal characteristics, other types of ratings that are not about your academic strength. And so this is an example where we're showing the fraction of kids who are assigned high non-academic ratings by the people evaluating their college applications, again, versus their parents' income, holding fixed their SAT scores. And you can see that if you come from a very high income family, you are much more likely to get a high non-academic rating from the admissions committee relative to kids from middle class families. Turns out this fact is entirely mediated by the high school that you attend. So we also see all the high schools that these kids are applying from. And the higher non-academic ratings are going to schools, kids from schools that kids from very high income families tend to attend. To make that clear, what we do is divide schools into 4 different groups, what we call disadvantaged public schools. So for example, in the Boston area, you might think about a place like the Somerville High School, which has relatively limited resources. And so, that's classified as a disadvantaged public high school. Then there's what we call an advantaged public high school, a public high school with a lot of resources, high per capita income on average. You might think about a place like the Lexington High School, for example. Then there are religious private schools and non-religious private schools, a place like Milton Academy, for instance, or Andover. And what you can see is, again, holding fixed test scores, the kids from the schools where you get the lowest non-academic ratings are places like Lexington. That's part of why you get that U shape, that kids from the upper middle class have the lowest chance of getting into these elite private colleges. The kids from the private schools, places like Milton Academy, tend to get the highest non-academic ratings, conditional on their SAT scores. and they also correspondingly have the highest chances of getting in, conditional on their academic credentials, into these elite private colleges. And because people from the top 1% are especially likely to attend those schools, that's what contributes to that kick up in that chart that I was showing you. So this is another set of factors that is, I think, limiting access for kids from lower income and middle class families to these colleges, the weight placed on these non-academic ratings, where, what's the intuition? Your access to extracurriculars or the ability to start a nonprofit or get a very strong recommendation letter and so on is much greater at certain very well-resourced schools relative to other schools. One last point, which is maybe salient to all of you in the context of the current debate, what is very predictive of later outcomes is not these non-academic credentials and legacy status, the things that are getting a lot of weight in the admissions process that are favoring kids from high-income families. What actually turns out to be most predictive of success in college and beyond, as measured by your income or the type of job you get, which graduate school you attend, turns out to be your SAT score. And things like high school grades or extracurricular activities or other things are much less predictive. And so this set of facts that I've just shown you very quickly, again, just to show how I think this type of work can matter in terms of policy. A number of you will be familiar with these changes. In light of this evidence, a number of colleges have now shifted in the direction of putting more weight on academic credentials, things like making the SAT mandatory again. Another example, Yale is now incorporating data from the Opportunity Atlas, which I showed you earlier in this talk, to contextualize where students are applying from in order to get a better sense of the environment and identify talent from under-resourced places. And there are now various efforts to try to reduce legacy preferences, which may also have some impact. So I've shown you in a number of different domains how I think we can do research that can actually have an impact going forward on changing access to opportunity. Let me conclude, especially in a community like this, by noting I think that these issues matter not just from the perspective of justice and fairness and making the American dream accessible to all, but they also matter from just a much more simple, sort of narrow-minded perspective of creating economic growth and creating better outcomes for all of us, sitting in this room. And one simple illustration of that is from this last piece of data that I'll show you, where in another study, we've linked the universe of patent records to the tax data to look at who goes on to become an inventor in America. And you can see that kids from high-income families are far more likely to become an inventor than kids from lower-income families, or about 10 times more likely to become an inventor if you happen to be born to parents in the top 1% relative to the middle class. And so why does that matter? What it means is that in the US, we have a big problem of what I'd call lost Einsteins. There are lots of kids who have the talent to come through the pipeline and invent something that would potentially change all of our lives, create many jobs, a new drug, a new technology that would improve everyone's well-being, but they're not coming through the pipeline, I think, because of the issues that we've been discussing in this lecture. And that problem is quite large in magnitude. We estimate that if women, kids from underrepresented minority backgrounds, and kids from low-income families were to invent at the same rate as high-income white men, you'd have 4 times as many inventors in America as you presently do. And so in that sense, there's a lot of lost talent. And this is not just an issue of fairness and justice. I think it's an issue of creating growth in America as a whole that we can all benefit from. And so I think that's yet another reason for all of us to be interested in these issues and hopefully make a difference going forward. So thanks so much, and happy to take your questions.
So if you'd like to ask a question, just please come up to one of the microphones and pose your questions.
Hi, Professor Chetty. So first, thank you. As a mother of a junior in high school who just came back from college tours, I'm both dismayed and hopeful at the same time. So I think thank you. My question is, you talked about communities where upward mobility moving from one community to another, and also things that happen within a community. I'm just curious about your thoughts on programs like METCO, where students stay where they live and are taken to other communities for educational opportunity.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, certainly very relevant in our context here. So, I think the simple answer is we don't yet know how effective programs like METCO are, where unlike the Moving to Opportunity program, where we have very clear evidence that when families actually move to higher opportunity, typically higher income neighborhood, their kids do much better. When the kids are just bussed in, does that have the same effect? It seems intuitive that it might, but I think one issue that arises, and this connects to the social capital mechanism that I think is very important here, is the extent to which the kids who are bussed in are actually integrated into the schools that they're attending. So what we see in many contexts in the data is that when you have that kind of busing program, there's a lot of what we call friending bias within the school. There's a lot of segregation within a school where the kids from lower income backgrounds or kids from different racial backgrounds are not actually interacting with the more affluent kids. They're not taking the same classes and so on. And if that social capital and connections and interaction is really the key thing, then I'd be concerned about whether that program truly is having the same effect. Now, that may be fixable. You could have additional programs to try to create that type of connection. There's some interesting interventions that people are trying in certain schools to that effect. But my instinct is understanding that is very important, and we don't yet know whether just a simple busing approach can be effective.
What efforts have you made to correct for the cost of living in an area? Like I was focusing in on some of your charts.
Yeah.
And particularly interested in Nebraska because I know a fair amount about it.
Yeah.
And $27,000 a year goes a lot further in Nebraska than it does in Boston.
Yep. Absolutely. So let me focus on the map on the left. I think you're absolutely right. Take much of the center of the country, the cost of living is much lower. Is that affecting our conclusions about upward mobility? How much is that driving the variation that we're seeing in these maps? So I'll answer that question in two parts. First, empirically, it turns out if you create measures of upward mobility that are adjusted for cost of living. So how do you do that? We have data on local rents. We have data on local prices. How much does it cost to buy groceries, things like that. You can use that to construct a local price index and construct real measures of income that adjust for the cost of living. Turns out when you do that for both the parents and the kids and create real measures of upward mobility, you get a map that looks almost identical to the one that I'm showing you here, which does not make those adjustments. It's correlated 0.9 with the map I'm showing you here, which means, basically it looks the same. So why is that intuitively? The core reason is that most kids tend to live very near the place that they grew up. So the average kid in America, as an adult, lives 17 miles away from where their mom lives. Okay, so that's a fact. And so if you take that, take kids living in the same area as their parents, what that means is, exactly as you gave in your example, take a place like Nebraska, the dollar goes further there than in a place like New York City. So it's true that once you adjust for cost of living, the kids in New York City are going to get pulled down in terms of their real income, but so are their parents. And upward mobility is really about the difference in outcomes between the kids and the parents. And that's why when you adjust for the cost of living, the map basically doesn't change. And so, it ends up that that's not the key driver of what we're seeing here.
Thanks for coming and spending your time. Fascinating research and amazing to see this story play out. So a couple of questions. One was, if you were to take this map and your first data point was how upward mobility has been going down over the years. So if you were to, have you done a study of this map over time? And what does it look like?
Great question. Yeah, so that's actually the next study our team is going to put out in about 2 months. How these maps are changing over time in recent years, where we now have the data to look at that, like in that dynamic sense. There have been some significant changes in the US. I won't get ahead of myself and say what's not yet public, but basically our sense is things are changing quite significantly in terms of economic opportunity for white and black Americans in ways that I think actually relate to the political discourse, and we hope will be helpful in shaping the narrative going forward. And that's certainly the path forward for research. Thanks.
Yeah. So I think some of what you're saying on these maps is a result of like self-segregation over the last few decades, where people who are more concerned about open mobility are moving to these areas, and they're sort of grouping together. And it's sort of, to your point, like all these people, if so much of success is based on your access to people who are in those higher groups and who are more motivated, it's exacerbating the problem, because all of the upper mobile people are getting together in the same places and leaving everyone else behind. And it's also causing, via real estate things, it's sort of locking it into income. Only people who are both motivated and affluent can afford to go to the upper mobile areas. So have you found any ideas yet for ways to sort of stop that problem from continuing to get worse, encouraging people to actually commingle a little more to improve the overall outcome without necessarily like impacting their own family?
Yeah, great question. So, when you talk, I focused here on what lower income people can get out of integration. And your question very naturally, in terms of making progress, especially politically, what do higher income people get out of it, right? I mean, it's a very natural question in terms of, do I actually want to support affordable housing? Do I want to support integration? All these things that we've been talking about. So let me make 2 points there. So the first is that there's a very interesting empirical pattern in the data where I've shown you these maps for kids starting out in low-income families. Using that website that I showed you, the Opportunity Atlas, you can click a toggle and look at the outcomes for kids starting out in high-income families and ask what they look like across these neighborhoods. And what you see is quite interesting, which is the neighborhood in which you grow up matters much less if you're from a high-income family than from a low-income family. And in particular, in these more integrated neighborhoods where you have more cross-class interaction, we see the kids from poor families doing much better, but the kids from high-income families are not doing worse. So it does not look like a zero-sum game. There's an asymmetry in this. And that, I think, is fundamental, because if it was a zero-sum game, then you're kind of just shuffling the deck chairs, and you can see higher income folks reasonably being worried about whether you want to be part of this more integrated society. But in fact, the more mixed income areas, it turns out, don't have significantly worse outcomes in economic terms for high income kids. So I view that as very encouraging, and I think just getting that message out there can be important. But second, that's just saying from an economic point of view, there's no cost, or the cost is small. But of course, even as an economist, I recognize that other things matter beyond income. And so, there's some other nice studies. So for example, former colleague of ours at Harvard, Gautam Rao, has a nice paper where he shows that when you experimentally have more integration at young ages, where you have kids from high-income families play with kids from lower-income families, and then track them over time, you see that the high-income kids now exhibit more charitable attitudes. They're more likely to donate. They're more likely to be involved in public service. I think insofar as many of us want our kids to have these kinds of values, integration may actually be beneficial for kids from high-income families. And so my sense is that's part of the fundamentals that can make this a plausible path forward.
Hi, thank you for all the research you do. Every time your paper comes out, I pour on it first as a parent. How can I game the system for my kids? And then the second part of my reaction as a citizen, my kids, many of us here in the house, the question becomes, can we do something from the bottom up to help, which is not necessarily a top-down policy change, but we as citizens normally, day to day, can we do something to actually help the maps look better?
Yeah, thank you. So, I think the simplest thing we can do at the personal level, I've talked here about policy, and I think that policy change, to be clear, sometimes top-down all the way to the federal level, but can also, as you've seen, at the level of colleges and schools in our local communities, I think we can make changes that make a difference. But there's also a question at just the personal level, independent of changing any policies, or something we can do as people to make a difference here. And here I would come back to the mechanism of connection and social capital and mentoring. We were talking over dinner actually about, possibly reaching out to people in other communities and trying to mentor kids from disadvantaged backgrounds who may not be thinking about applying to college or may not be aware of a career path in whatever field you're in. And I think it's sometimes shocking, even in the Boston area, a place with lots of opportunity, great educational institutions and so on, many people just simply have not thought of that they could be following these paths. And I think connecting to people through your work or through your service in this way can potentially make quite a significant difference.
Hi, my name is Wanda Anhiachi, and I'm a recent graduate from the University of Massachusetts Lowell. And I want to, first of all, say that I'm really kind of intrigued by your research. It's very powerful. But one question that I want to ask is that, I mean, you've done this incredible research, but what has been the policy response, especially from the state, Massachusetts, the city, Boston? We've looked at Lexington, Somerville. What has been the response from these stakeholders in terms of making things better? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, what has been the policy response in terms of this research? What have people done, particularly here in Massachusetts, but I will take that more generally. What have people done in light of these kinds of data, these kinds of findings? And I guess what I would point you to is this is why, in the second half of the talk, I tried to give some examples along those lines, which I see as encouraging at different levels of aggregation, from Congress to changes in colleges to changes in cities like Charlotte. Now, that's by no means universal. Those are some examples. There are many other places that are doing things, high schools across America, trying to create more connection, change the way they're thinking about affordable housing and so forth. But there are vast swaths of communities. The country is huge, and there's so many different jurisdictions, so many different people involved, where I think there's a lot of change to be made. So part of what I think we're hoping to do, as Rita very kindly said in her introduction, is to try to change the way that people think about these issues, that change is possible. And also importantly, that you can approach what I think people often view as political questions where ideology comes into play, that you can approach that from a scientific, relatively objective perspective and make progress. So I have found that while I think a lot of people have the view that we're at a standstill, incredibly politically polarized, people fall back on their ideologies, nobody wants to have ineffective programs and waste money. And we spend more than $1 trillion a year in the US on trying to combat poverty. My sense is we can do that much more effectively. And by doing this sort of scientific work and making it accessible to the public, my hope is that can at least be a step in that direction.
Dr. Chetty, thank you very much for your presentation. First, your analysis in social sciences here with respect to big data and data science has been truly eye-opening. My question is in reference to your March 2018 study, which looked at minority boys, specifically African-American boys, who came from wealthy families, not upper middle income families. So I'm presuming that's at least in the top 1%.
Yes.
And in that study, it showed that those boys coming from the wealthy families, 20% of them ended up in low income, not low middle income, but low income. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, thanks so much. So, thanks for reading the work, and you're exactly right. So maybe some of you're referring to a graphic that the New York Times had on the front page of its website for many, many days, where they had this very nice depiction where you could see kids starting out in the highest income families in America, and you ask in the next generation, where do they end up? And you see this, what I've found one of the most disturbing patterns in our research, where for Black men, even if you start out, as you've noted, in the highest income families in the US, you have a very high probability of ending up in the middle or even the bottom of the income distribution and not remaining at the top. Whereas for kids for white men, if you start out in a high income family, you basically, odds are you're going to remain at the top of the income distribution. So first, just why is that profoundly important? If you think about the persistence of racial disparities in the United States, I think that fact really lies at the core of it. So the way I think about it is that for white Americans, achieving the American dream is like climbing a ladder, where you start off in the next generation, typically where you left off in the last generation. For Black Americans, it's more like being on a treadmill, where even after you've made the climb in one generation, there are these tremendous structural forces that end up pushing you back down, only to have to make the climb again. That treadmill is exactly why racial disparities persist for decades or centuries in this country. If that treadmill were fixed, then you would see Black Americans, if they're able to make progress in one generation, maintain that progress and be able to move forward from there. So now the question is, why is that happening? And so, what I want to say there is, I think there are multiple things. We don't quite know the answer yet, but I think it's again related to who people are connected to, what their networks look like. It might be related to some extent to discrimination, although that's hard to pin down perfectly. I think even when Black kids attend affluent schools, live in the best neighborhoods, they're interacting with a very different group of people and have a very different set of opportunities. All of that seems to matter, and it shows you that income doesn't insulate you from that.
Less the why, but more the magnitude. It was 20%. I thought 22% actually. That's to me is a very significant number, going from top 1% to
that's right.
The absolute bottom.
Yeah, and I think you're right to emphasize that. Another way to say that is your odds of falling to the bottom are almost the same as your odds of remaining at the top, which is remarkable if you think about, you're going to the best schools, living in the best neighborhoods, growing up in a very high income family. That shows you the depth of the problem. So thanks for emphasizing that.
Professor Chetty, thanks for coming tonight. When you showed the slides that were split by gender and race, one of the questions I was wondering is, given how patently unfair our criminal justice system has seemed of late, have you been able to get access to that data? Are you able to control for incarceration impact and other impacts of how our system impacts people?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely, critical question. I have a number of colleagues at Harvard, economists like Will Doby at the Kennedy School and Crystal Yang at the law school, who are thinking about these issues in particular. And we can now get data on incarceration from administrative systems and link it to these data and understand the role that incarceration plays in these patterns. And no doubt, it's an important part of what's going on. So to give you one statistic, similar to the shocking statistics we were talking about before, turns out that if you look at the lowest Black men growing up in the lowest income families in the US, on any given day, 20% of those men are incarcerated, which, if you think about it, is just like shockingly high. That's on a single day. So if you think about your odds of incarceration at some point over your lifetime, it's going to be something like 50% for those kids, for those Black boys growing up in the lowest income families. And of course, while you're incarcerated, your capacity to earn is extremely limited. But then after you're released, you also have a mark of a criminal record that may greatly diminish your prospects to earn. So I think as a mediating factor on the pathway of issues, incarceration is important. However, what we also see in the data is that even before kids are incarcerated for the first time, there are enormous differences in their outcomes between Black men and white men. So they're on very different paths even prior to incarceration. If you look at things like test scores, graduation rates, earnings, employment rates. And so while I think incarceration amplifies these problems, I don't think it's where it originates. I think a lot of these problems originate upstream in the schools, in the communities in which these kids are growing up. So certainly mass incarceration is not helping, and it's amplifying the problems we've been talking about. But I'm not convinced from looking at the data that simply addressing the issue of mass incarceration, as challenging as it is, would actually fundamentally change this map. I think there are deeper challenges than that.
Thank you.
Professor Chetty, you mentioned at the outset that you have access to anonymized tax records, and yet at times you seem to be implying that you're linking children to specific tax records of parents. How are you doing that?
Yeah. I'll tell you a little bit about how this works behind the scenes. So internally at the Census Bureau, there's basically an encryption algorithm where everyone's social security numbers and other identifying information is scrambled. But then they maintain a key, like a hashing system that allows you to link those records behind the scenes. And then we worked with that linked data in anonymized form without the underlying identifiers. So that system is very powerful because we're not looking at anyone's identifying information. And we're not, from a research perspective, we're interested in the statistical patterns in aggregation, right? Not any one person's outcomes. But that methodology is extremely useful, not just for linking parents to kids, but doing things like linking housing voucher data to the tax records, linking data on college attendance records or SAT scores. That's how all of this is working behind the scenes. And that's part of what I want to illustrate methodologically, how those big data tools, I think, can really help us understand these questions.
So fundamentally, it's the Social Security number that's linking all these different records?
Exactly, but not directly because you have some encryption in the middle.
Okay, thank you.
So part of the, you had that Facebook and sort of you have this evidence that social capital is this strong causative effect of this upward mobility.
Yeah.
And so it's very hard to sort, like we talked about busing, the education might not work, but talk about moving people, but there are sort of long-term formal busing in the social mobility, like AmeriCorps, City Year, Big Brothers, Big Sisters.
Yes.
And so you have these formal programs that look at bringing in these mentors, teachers to sort of look at the diamond in the rough. And I was just wondering if you have any evidence or sort of have looked at these formalized moving the social capital into this where that needs to be, and does that have any measurable effect on the upward mobility?
Yep, yeah, so absolutely. So there have been some evaluations. So for example, I have a student named Alex Bell who did an evaluation of a randomized trial of Big Brothers, Big Sisters. And you find some evidence of positive impacts. Kids who randomly had the chance to have a big brother or big sister are more likely to attend college, for example. And so there's some evidence, but I would say the evidence on those kinds of mentoring programs is not completely clear, completely systematic. And my reading of it is that the intensity of this matters tremendously. So light touch interventions where you're doing an hour or two of trying to provide this type of connection maybe can have some impact, but it's extremely different from living and completely sort of imbibing a very different neighborhood from a young age. And so I think the trick is, if the dosage matters, as I was showing you in some of these charts, how do you actually get to a sufficiently high dose in order to really have a profound impact through these external programs? And I think that's the challenge. So I think they can work, but the question is, can you do things that can really ramp up the intensity? That's the type of thing we need to figure out.
Thank you.
Thank you for your work and for your presentation. In the curve that you have, or the map that you have here and the map you had before, the focus is on an average. And I wondered whether you have a distribution of that, or before you get to that average, and whether distribution, the shape of those distributions remain the same, are changing, broader, multi-peaks, and so forth. Thank you.
So what we're basically seeing in most of these things, generally, it's not always true, tends to be just an upward shift in the distribution, which means that all percentiles you're seeing better outcomes. There are some cases where you'll see certain places are particularly good at getting you into the very upper tail. Certain places are particularly good at keeping you out of poverty. So it's not one for one that it always shifts up like that, and all of that data actually is publicly accessible. I'll give you one example where the difference is very salient. We find in the context of colleges that the colleges that I spent some time on, the elite private colleges, they are particularly good at launching you into the top 1% or into positions of leadership defined in various different ways. Turns out if you go to a place like Harvard versus a top flagship state school like University of Michigan or UC Berkeley, it doesn't matter so much in terms of average incomes. What really it affects is the upper tail part of the distribution. So there's certainly cases like that where it makes a difference.
I worked in high tech for about 50 years, and I started out. The company I worked for completely paid my tuition. See it better, they'd reimburse me. The company benefited from my skills, and they invested in me. I don't see that around. Now, you're lucky to get a job that's not a contract or a temporary thing.
Yeah.
And is it something that business is bringing on themselves, or is it a accounting fluke or something? Can you shed light on that?
Yeah. I mean, so those kinds of policies in principle would make a lot of sense. Like this actually relates in some ways to Oliver's pioneering work on what firms do. I think the way economists think about it is that there's no incentive really from a dynamic point of view for a firm to do, especially in the modern, very competitive era, to make the kind of investment that they made in your case, because the worry is if Google invests a lot in paying for a person's education and training them, what is there to prevent Amazon from hiring that well-trained person and not having to bear that cost? And so a famous result in economics is that in a market equilibrium, there's not going to be an incentive for private firms to invest in that kind of human capital because they can't capture the returns necessarily. If you could write a contract that said, you must work for me for the next 10 years so I get a rate of return on that, then that'd be great. But in a very high mobility society, that's not not legal and not really feasible. Then it's really left to the public sector or other agents to make these kinds of investments. I think that's the problem, even though it can work.
So that's why we have our student loan crisis and things like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you. This is fascinating data. Oh, okay.
I know you wanted to speak to everyone, but it is getting to be 10 or so. So this lady will be our last question.
Sounds good.
But everyone who still has a question is welcome to come up and ask it. I don't want to keep you captive, even though this is riveting.
Happy to take a last question.
No, I'll be really quick. Thank you, Dr. Chetty. This is fascinating data, and I do appreciate that at the hyper-local level, there are all of these differences in upward mobility. But if you took a step back, there also seems to be some regional or state-level differences, as you pointed out, the South versus the Middle, Dubuque you mentioned. Are there specific industries that could perhaps, help drive the economy for the whole region and perhaps, in a way, address that inequity?
Yeah, so your observation's right. It can't be entirely at the local level, because if it were, then when you zoom out to the regional level, everything would look the same on average. So there's kind of a fractal property to the data where if you keep cutting it, you continue to see a lot of variation. So what's driving the regional variation? My sense is there are systematic differences across the regions in the factors that we identify at the local level. So if you look at the quality of the schools in the South, for example, or you look at the economic connectedness measures, on average, the South is much more segregated than the Midwest. Rural Midwestern towns tend to have good schools. There tends to be a lot of cross-class interaction. All of these things also vary at the regional level. I don't think it's about industry or jobs. That's why I started out with that first plot, where if you look across metro areas or across regions, it doesn't seem like it's about jobs. It seems like even the regional variation might be related to these factors that we identified at the more local level.
All right, thank you.
Great. Okay, very good. Thank you.
To applaud, but you did that all on your own. And as you can see, we exploded the time limits that we promised Professor Chetty. But if anyone wants to speak to him, please come up and talk. Thank you very much again. Till next time.